extremely friendly introduction by Professor Schmidt, and yeah, it's warming. But my textbook is now getting really very old, and it's not apparently collecting dust, but I have given up, let's say, going for a 4th edition, and the reason was that the 3rd edition cost me a full year to revise it properly, given the very many topics that, and it was simply impossible to combine that with other work. And also, the publisher doesn't want such a voluminous 2-column, small font type textbook because it doesn't sell in nowadays anymore. So he wanted me to split up the Pearson education, and I refused to do that. And they say, yeah, but you only sell to teachers, not to students. So that was the end of our joint adventure, just as a background. Nonetheless, at the moment, I teach at Goethe University in Frankfurt, and I teach basically the first half of my textbook, but in a much more modern fashion. But since my old textbook is pointless, I use the Geneva boys, of course, Baldwin and Wieplos, and I can tell you that sometimes I have the feeling that Professor Schmidt is right, but only sometimes. Now, more generally, first of all, I want to thank the organizers that I was invited to Arbeitskreis. If you're not shocked by my old age, but my first Tagung in the Arbeitskreis was 1981 in Augsburg, which was absolutely lovely. And I want to, I have attended a number of them in the 80s and even 1 or 2 in the 90s. And I think they are really lovely. It's true that it's more legal often and institutional than economic, but I still have learned an immense amount from the level and very respectful discussions in the Arbeitskreis. And therefore I was very glad to say yes, even though the day is completely wrong for me, it doesn't matter.
May I just say it was organized by Professor Meesen in Augsburg, and I was a very young assistant participating and seeing you.
Yeah, I was then also pretty young, I can assure you. Now, on my presentation, I counted on having roughly 15-20 minutes and then discussion. So if I don't fill it up entirely, it is for that reason. It is lightly coordinated with Friedemann Kainer, but only lightly, because we saw 4 presentations with titles, and Friedemann and I were afraid that there would be too much overlap. And that's why we coordinated a bit. My presentation is therefore not the normal sort of fundamental beginnings and all the rest of it. It is strictly based on a report to the European Parliament that will come out today or tomorrow, at least online. It wasn't there this morning, but we will place it also on our website immediately. So if not today, then tomorrow. The website from SEPS is very simple, seps.eu, cannot be more simple, and it would be there prominently. Now, this report is a long report, and it's written, and that's the first time that I can ever remember, by 2 think tanks that normally compete, Bruegel and SEPS, then with a group of lawyers called VVA and Copenhagen Economics. So the 4 authors are from these 4 think tanks, or whatever you call them. And we had a division of labor, and of course we had a very tight straitjacket from the European Parliament staff and MEPs. So in that sense, my presentation is only sort of a short list of some items that I thought would need less or not covered by other speakers. And you might get a bit confused that I jump from A to B and to C, but then you know the background. And the European Parliament, of course, does not want long academic debates or highly principled legal or indeed economic exercises. It might want some economics, but not this time. I've been deeply involved in several exercises on the cost of non-Europe, where you do, this kind of economics. Even last year, where we did some very rough, I must admit, very rough estimate of the further liberalization of the services under the Services Directive. That's a report I wrote alone for the European Parliament. So, but not today. Today, I will stick to what kind of problems do we see, what kind of measures could we propose. So the European Parliament emphasized two words: be pragmatic and solution-oriented. So that is what I tried to do. The reports on the single market, and there are many, are either full of complaints about non-Europe. I have a whole, series in my library, or you get short propagandistic reports on how unique the single market is, how deep, how strong, how successful. And our report belongs to the first category. But we do also focus a bit on solutions, and I will do a bit of that today, and also with reminders about achievements. So we will also have a list, and I will select from that list 4 or 5 items. I will first say something about the single market as an EU treasure, because that is what it is. It's good to be irritated by its shortcomings. There's also a cost to these shortcomings. So we have every reason to complain, but we should also keep the thing in proportion. The EU is very blessed with the single market as we have it. And one of the most strong proponents that I regularly worked with for at least 2 decades was the UK. And it's actually amazing that a small group of fanatic Brexiteers in the UK has, by all sorts of tricks and God knows what, been able to turn the UK around as saying we want to get out of the single market, which to me is still not only very regrettable, but it's completely illogical given what they have stood for before. But once you have the single market and it is as robust as it is today, because it's so strong and given, it also induces free riding by member states. Because rather than accusing the Eurocrats for all sorts of things, we should be much more critical about the nation-crats in the council. The funny mindset that many of these people occasionally have, and don't forget, the council secretariat is in Brussels, but the council is not. These are individual nation-crats that take a train or a plane, sit in a council meeting, the next day are back in their capital. And it is not always clear. Of course, in general, they all love the single market. This is hardly an issue. And we have seen that in the Brexit very, very clearly. All member states other than the UK have been completely united in this wish to maintain and even improve the single market. Nonetheless, because it is so robust, they all look for little things that they can nibble away from for their own purposes, whatever the reason. So I'll say a bit about that, and then I will go into 5 topics, but all short. I will say something about public procurement, about mutual recognition in goods, about regulatory heterogeneity in services and why that is important. That's also in our report, but we also show that it's really worthwhile to do much more empirical work on that because it's a huge problem that is hardly discussed. Then a better deal for posted workers, and a small complaint about the unitary patent, not about the patent itself, but about your beloved court in Karlsruhe. First, about the single market as an EU treasure. And in fact, Friedemann Kainer has already mentioned it, and I can only support this. The single market has deepened and widened further. And if you just look back 10 years ago, when the Monti report was published, and when there was this huge list, if you check the over 100 items in the Monti report, about half has been addressed in one form or another, sometimes fully, sometimes partly. Things have moved. Are there another 50 that we should complain about and new ones? Yes, but you cannot deny that there is a lot going on in the single market, and it doesn't get to the front page of the news, or rarely so, but a lot is happening, and I think that is good to note. In the goods markets, there's a lot to be content about. Mutual recognition works imperfectly. I will say something about that, but we should also be aware that there is no real good statistics on where it works, because that's not registered anywhere. So it is, yes, the complaints, and I will go into that, but we should also be conscious that mutual recognition often does work, and we don't know the extent. What I am particularly impressed by is EU risk regulation. That, you know, if it's about goods, practically all regulation in goods is about risk regulation. That is driven by 5 points: health, safety, consumer protection, well, basically those 3 and some small other things. But if you talk about health, safety, consumer protection, and the environment, of course, then risk regulation is phenomenal. A lot of it is now regulatory impact assessment tested. We have now 17 years of RIAs, and we have a gradually improving ex post testing of a lot of regulation, so that it is not unduly costly, or that the gains we get by regulation is also undermined by some of the costs that we create. And I think there we have also moved enormously, and with some understanding in the Parliament and the Council. I don't know whether you know that, but usually when there is a new proposal from the Commission in the Council now, since I think about 3 years, 4 years, when it is discussed the first time, the relevant High Commission official comes and explains the impact assessment first. And then the Council begins to talk. The same happens in the Parliament in somewhat different ways, because they have their own impact assessment function in the staff. And these things are extremely helpful to improve the quality of EU regulation. And we could also say something about technical standards, which are so important for goods, but that I will only do if there is some interest in this often forgotten but very well accomplished issue. In services, the single services market has also deepened a lot, but there are hiccups. There is member state unwillingness, and it's also not well understood. I give from my own profession an example about economic textbooks. That's very different from law. In economics, there is hardly any textbook on economic integration that deals extensively with services. Also, Baldwin and Wiplos don't do that. It's very marginal, and the rest of the book is full of goods. And there are 1 or 2 other textbooks. It's really very strange, because services are extremely important in their various modes. One, of course, is the mode of trading directly, mode 1, the services from the place of provision all the way to the receiver somewhere else in another country. But also mode 3 via FDI, foreign direct investment. This is very, very important. But in the EU, all 4 modes, also the mode of temporary provision of services via posted workers, and also that the consumer moves to get the service provided somewhere else. All these 4 modes are basically free in the EU, and And altogether, it is extremely important. There is continuous politicians who keep saying, yeah, the trade in goods, they mean mode one, the trade in services across the border is less than the trade in goods across the border. And that is really, yeah, that shows that they don't understand anything about services. A lot of services are supplied via mode three. And this is absolutely critical. We have now better statistics on mode three, and we should really refrain from using only mode one, which is the second most and not the first most important supplier of cross-border services in the EU. We also see that financial services, because of the link with EMU finally, and the crisis, let's not forget that, has now enormously deepened. And the reticence to have really common, strong agencies has finally been given up in that field. And only then you can get a well-functioning single market for banking services, for example. But also factor market integration is often forgotten, or at least only very partially dealt with, also in textbooks, by the way. So factor market integration, first of all, in investment, even portfolio, I think now because of the monetary union and the banking union, it's much more improved. But in foreign direct investment, we have few difficulties in 1962, except in some sectors. And one is, for example, retail. If you look at a thing called the Regulatory Restrictiveness Index in retail, it's called the Retail Restrictiveness Index. If you would Google that and you get it from the DG Grow 2017 publication, Google will do that probably for you. You get statistics in a beautiful graph where you see the various restrictions of all the member states in retail on operation, but before you get them on the FDI, on actually getting to invest from another country. And you will be surprised how detailed these statistics are. Then on labor, they're directly migrating. The original idea of labor mobility is not much of a problem, so it seems. But of course, there are a number of cases that we all know are very difficult. Professor Keiner has already spoken about it. It's very strongly in the field of professional services. Don't forget that 22% of all the services jobs are professionals. And that's so it's a lot. And there are lots of problems. The question now is, and the European Commission will launch a detailed investigations for all the member states plus the 3 EEA states about how domestically this proportionality idea, and also you remember the new proportionality directive of 1 or 2 years ago, is going to be applied, and how you should apply that. What is a right and a wrong way to apply proportionality is not an easy issue anywhere and anyhow, but certainly not with professionals. But my biggest problem is in codified technology, where I have always held, and I still want to say that now very clearly, that there was a deep flaw in the Rome Treaty. In Article 345 now, I don't remember the Rome Treaty article, about it's only one line, the systems of ownership are in the realm of the member states. But the system of ownership have two sides. And very smartly by some lobbyists somehow, they were put under one label, namely systems of ownership. But codified technology, that is copyright, patents and all the rest, IPRs basically, which are a factor of production, are very different from having state-owned enterprises of a state. And these two things should not be brought together. They are completely different. And that the SOEs are a national decision. How they function is something else, but that there is a national decision on whether or not you want to have state-owned enterprises or maybe privatize them again is one thing and completely unrelated to codified technology under IPRs. And this has cost Europe a lot over the 6-7 decades. And the biggest absurdity of that is that we didn't have a common patent. And I'll come back to that later. Excuse me, I'm looking for the right. No, this one. Yes, sorry. The single market begins at home is not just a slogan, although surely it is a slogan. I was struck, but we have many very competent lawyers here, that Article 26 deleted the word proper. Why not use the word proper functioning? Because the test is of a higher quality. It must have been scrapped by pressures of member states who said that is too ambitious, that standard is too high. That's my feeling. Because member states are somewhat ambivalent on the single market. They all want it in general. They cannot understand the UK, true. But in the council, as I noted, they often seek exceptions or go slow or do not commit or even block. And it shouldn't be like that. It can occasionally be like that, but it's every time again, it is very difficult as it appears in Brussels. And member states are also less committed to enforce the single market at home. And endless examples of that. So that's why our report throws up the question, we haven't answered it, but we throw up the question, shouldn't we finally, after many hesitations, think of establishing EU-linked national enforcement agencies or committees? So the single market enforcing at home is the minimum what member states can do for the single market. And when member states propose own laws, that there is an impact assessment connected, which checks in part also whether it is likely to be not in conflict or indeed supports single market law. And I think that's an absolutely normal thing that you should expect from member states. And that is what we advocate. That EU-linked national enforcement committees can solve a bit of the basic enforcement gap, the mindset of the member states. I will now go into a number of these specific topics. This is about public procurement. At first, I have 6 bullet points on why it is going well with public procurement, and you can read with me very quickly. On all of these things, I could extensively comment. You might perhaps wonder what the meat principle is. The meat principle is the principle that you don't judge tenders for public procurement only on price, but on the most economically advantageous tender. And this could be for environmental purposes, for social purposes, or indeed for innovation purposes. This is called strategic public procurement. That's much harder to objectively assess, and therefore it is more complicated, but in many cases it can be much better for the country or indeed for Europe in general. And there are a number of other things, especially I want to ask attention for e-procurement, which is in full swing and started 5 years ago, and is amazing what is happening there. But let us also talk about the buts. There are also drawbacks. There are 16 member states that have 20% of their tenders with only one single bidder. And of course, that's a plain denial of the idea of European public procurement. 5% of tenders of member states are simply not published. And 4 of the member states have a rate of unpublished tenders above 20%, which is of course totally unacceptable. National remedies, there member states insist that they all have their own judicial systems, yeah, which of course is true. But if you look at the consequences for remedies and you look at the figures, it is absolutely shocking what consequences that has. And that's, I think, personally, not acceptable. It's perhaps something that hardly anybody looks at. Because, yeah, it's national and we have this national judicial review, but it's not marginally different. It is radically different. And it's therefore highly uneven. And also waiting times are there's now a network of the national authorities that are dealing with these remedies. And I hope that something can be done seriously. Then a big problem in public procurement is professionalism. We tend to think as academics, maybe naively, that public procurement is done by experienced people, but that's very often, and that's with authorities that do this regularly, that's surely the case. But there are way over 250,000 authorities and agencies that buy under EU tender rules. And you can easily think that 200,000 of them do this very rarely. And the professionalism of these people is lousy. There is no other conclusion after so many reports. So there is literally desperate need that these smaller buyers are helped or are grouped with central purchasing agencies of some kind, and that they are better trained, and so on and so forth. Then finally, there is now a public procurement scoreboard as part of the overall internal market scoreboard. And of the 324 entries for the member states, 27 member states, no less than 140 of these entries are red. So unsatisfactory. So in public procurement, there's things to do. Here you see the last 4 years, the single bidder shares of the member states. And you see that some come extremely high. A number of them come above 20, but there are 2 even reaching 50%. And this is really very worrying. It's also a trend. The single bidder shares have increased the last 8-9 years. And we plead for a review that the European Commission should do something about it, beginning by really studying carefully and then act. This is another one where member states don't publish that there is a bid, that there is a tender for which you can bid. And that's, of course, even further reaching denial of the idea of European public procurement. The sort of Brussels norm is it shouldn't be above 5, but there are quite a few that are just marginally above 5, and 4 that are way above 5%. Sometimes no calls for bids have to do with sort of dependency on previous contracts with special expertise, but it should remain absolutely minimal, and it is not. So here are some solutions. There must be a review of the Commission of these what I just showed in these 2 slides. There should be a really conscious and energetic following up of the Commission strategy of 2013 on better public procurement. I cannot explain that all now. It has 6 points, and all 6 make eminent sense. And some points are better followed than other ones. It should also be more strategic with greater professionalism, and that can only be achieved if central purchasing bureaus can do this, or when you combine procurement with different agencies. There's a lot to say there, but it is a field that is now really moving, and it has to be exploited in a much better way. There's also, we have in 2014 a new direction, apart from goods and services and bigger contracts for works and so on. We have a special directive for concessions. Concessions are big public-private partnerships usually, and we know very little about them. So in our report, we call attention to that. There is no report yet on how they function and this is and there is a lot of legal uncertainty, and we think this has to be addressed very carefully. We encourage the e-procurement to be fully implemented by 2023. The remedies I've already talked about, and then the splintering. When I dived into this problem, I came across some new, very detailed statistics, and it was absolutely stunning that the number of contracts in some EU member states is a huge multiple from the number of contracts in other member states. If you include all the 27 member states, or with the statistics still the UK, because the statistics are of course a few years behind, then you find that the number of contracts in total on public procurement, so also under the EU threshold, are 32 times the ones above the EU threshold. So that means that the EU threshold tenders would be just a very small fraction. But that's due to two countries, Romania and Italy. If you take them out, because they have far over, Romania has 2.3 million contracts a year. Italy, something like 1.4 or so, or 1.8, I forgot. Germany, I come back to that. That's something else. But if you take them out, the number of contracts in total is 8 times the number of contracts above the EU threshold. Why have Italy and Romania done splintering of PP contracts to such extreme? I give a number of examples in the report. One is that Romania, for example, in a few years, just before 2020, has 400 times the number of contracts in the Netherlands, although Romania and the Netherlands are more or less equally big. So how is that possible? And there are some other really telling examples in that. If we splinter in order to help SMEs, we can also, forgive me the funny term, oversplinter and really make it incredibly inefficient. The German case is different because it has long been observed that in Germany, the number of publications for above EU threshold public procurement was extremely low. Except for one other country, the lowest, far the lowest. And all sort of countries that are around Germany, including France, Benelux, Denmark, you name it, all have at least 3 to 4 times as much as percentage-wise. So how is that possible? Now, in 2018, there has been an extremely detailed report on German practices. And let me stick now to no more than saying that there are quite some problematic practices there, and they have partly to do with your practicing of, let us call, local federalism, with extremely curious budget rules, which have the practical consequence that things don't get under the EU rules, although they ought to be. And I wanted to call attention.
Sorry for my intervention. Facing the time constraints, may I give you the notice that you can finalize your presentation in 2 minutes? Is it possible?
I'll do everything depending on how many seconds that go in a minute.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
No, you're totally forgiven. So I have also 2 slides on mutual recognition in goods. I think with the new regulation last year and some other reasons, it has improved, but we still have some further points. Lawyers very typically, and I first did that too, I must admit, look at this regulation as the answer to mutual recognition, but it's not. It is an answer. But the far bigger answer is regulation. And in slide 13, that's exactly what I explained. And particularly at the bottom, it is really some specific sectors which are the problem in mutual recognition for 95%. and I could say more about that, but I now have to go on. This is about regulatory heterogeneity, and it's very difficult in the good company of all these EU specialists to explain it, because regulatory heterogeneity may fall only partly under EU law and partly not. But for business, look at my fourth bullet point, this is completely irrelevant. If business wants to exploit the single market for services, regulatory heterogeneity hinders them enormously. And it doesn't matter whether that's illegally correct or not correct. And we must really think about lowering regulatory heterogeneity. And we have some data because the costs are huge. And here you see something that inside the EU, regulatory heterogeneity is much lower than via the GATS, but it's still very high for the businesses. Then we have something on posted workers and some advice on what to do in slide 17, partly about the European Labour Authority. With all the lawyers here, the European Labour Authority is about cooperation between member states, administrative and otherwise, joint investigations, but it has very little rights. It cannot really check documents independently without permission from the various member states. And we think that that is really a pity. This is my last slide, and the title says it all: The Tragedy of the Unitary Patent. One of the best things that has happened to the single market recently is the establishment, the conclusion of the unitary patent. It is so important for the EU. If we want to innovate, all these funds and programs are not nearly as good as having one single unitary patent, which is also a low-cost patent. Not even speaking about the enforcement, which is also common. And innovation is so critical for the EU future. So read my last bullet but one. How on earth can a clearly obstructive attempt before the Bundesverfassungsgericht not be addressed with the greatest urgency? And the Gericht has twice now add another year before they are actually going to look at it, with 25 other countries just waiting there. I fail to understand it, particularly because this is something that is keeping the EU busy since 1962, and we have paid cumulatively an enormous cost. With that, I want to end, because a little bit of complaining, I hope you forgive me doing that.